Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Schenker, president of Prestige Economics and chairman of the Futurist Institute. I'm here today to talk about the tech industry in Cold War II. I will speak specifically about some risks, threats, and opportunities. And there are many. My remarks today are going to touch on 4 specific areas. I'm going to talk about the risks, threats, and opportunities to technology businesses and what it means for your assets, your operations, your money, and your people. What we've termed and trademarked as Cold War II, we've been talking about for several years. We were concerned that the tensions geopolitically we see globally would rise between China and Russia on the one hand, and the U.S. and its allies on the other. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And as I think about an official start date for Cold War II, I actually look at a wedding. And it happened on February 4th, 2022. You might have missed it because it was that thing where people get married and there's something else going on, and the other something going on was the Olympics. And the folks who got married were China and Russia. They issue a statement, you can find it on the Kremlin's website, saying 2 key things. 1, there's no limit to the cooperation between China and Russia. And 2, they strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War. Now that's a pretty normal thing to say maybe in 1945 or 46 or maybe even 47. Seems really weird to say in 2022. And just for a refresher, this is a map from the UN of what the world looked like after the Second World War in 1945. And the big takeaways here, of course, are China bigger, Russia bigger. This isn't a hidden secret of what the agenda would be if this is the outcome you're defending in that statement you make at your wedding. This didn't come out of nowhere, though, and a lot of this goes back to Cold War I. It goes back to a series of seeds that were sown. And I happen to be reminded of this just last week. I was out in California, and I was visiting a friend. Going to be in Orange County. We had some time to kill. And he said, let's go check out the Nixon library. We can just walk around, see some stuff. I'm not like a Nixon fan, but I'm like, all right, let's go see the thing. So we check out the Nixon library, and there's all kinds of stuff there. And probably one of the most prominent things that I think echoes to today is the picture of President Nixon shaking hands with Zhou Enlai at the airport on his visit to China in 1972. This was very much a mission accomplished moment when we think about the beginning of the end of the Cold War in U.S.-Chinese relations. What this did with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong on one side and Kissinger and Nixon on the other, what this did was draw a wedge between the Soviet Union and China. Part of that deal was a one China policy. The check that was written was Taiwan. And that bill is now coming due, at least in China's mind. So if you walk around the library, it looks like, wow, this is it, another kind of piece in our time. But no, this is a conflict deferred. And so what ends the first Cold War is now pushing towards a second. But this isn't the only thing that was a seed sown of conflict today. And by the way, I realize for many of you this may feel like ancient history, right? I mean, this is 52 years ago. I'm young-ish, right? I'm 46. I was born in 1977. And if I think about 1925, which was 52 years before I was born, I mean, that sounds like really ancient history, right? And I'm sure to many of you, you're like, 1972, that's a long time ago. It feels less long for me because I lived most of it, but it is a while ago, but it's not that long. What's even more in recent past is if we look just 35 years ago to 1989. when the Berlin Wall falls, and in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses. And as a result, Russia loses territory, and now that's what they're pushing back against, right? These seeds of the end of the Cold War sow the seeds for the Second Cold War. Now, it didn't come out of nowhere, though. This has been going on and building for a little while. And we've seen a trend of eroding relations between Russia and China on the one hand and the U.S. on the other. That's allies. We see it even in public opinion polls. You know, you look back to 2017, 2018. This is a survey, YouGov surveys. China, do you think they're an enemy? That's the red line. Do you think they're an ally in blue? Or you're not sure in gray? Back in 2017, it was pretty much 40%, 40%, whether China was an ally or an enemy. And now it's very clearly 80% say China's an enemy, and 8.7% say China's an ally. And by the way, in a country and a time as we're looking towards elections and we're wondering what are bipartisan issues, is there anything the parties agree on? Is there anything the American public agrees on? Well, this is one of them. I think daylight savings time, like getting rid of that's the other, but this is definitely one where we've actually seen traction. And as those tensions have risen, we've also seen trade restrictions coming along with it. The Section 232 and 301 tariffs that were implemented in 2018, first to target aluminum and steel imports in order to make sure we're producing enough domestic aluminum and steel, and the 301 tariffs, which were implemented to protect U.S. technology IP. Those kicked off a greater trade war. And a lot of times you end up in a trade war that leads to a further escalation of conflict. But of course, the trade war hasn't stopped there, right? Even just last August, the White House, and by the way, right, I know the 232, 301 tariffs, those were implemented under the Trump administration. And I think many people thought, well, under a Biden administration, maybe they'd roll that back. No, we saw the China concern's a bipartisan issue. And the Biden administration's pushed it forward. This is a bipartisan thing. No matter who ends up in the White House in the fall, no matter what happens, we're going to probably see even more trade restrictions with China, even more trade tensions going forward. But the executive order list issued last August targeted really critical evolving technologies, maybe some that you are working on in your businesses, right? If you're working on AI, quantum, semiconductors, and microprocessors, right, there are restrictions around who you can do business with. And that's related to the People's Republic of China and the administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. But that's not where it ends, right? We see trade restrictions are not just up between the US and China, they're up globally. This is data from the IMF. On the left-hand side, you can see back 10, 12 years ago, there were only about 300 to 400 trade restrictions globally. In 2022, it was close to 3,000, almost tenfold higher. And as we look on the chart on the right, you can see the axes. The red line is geopolitical risk on the right-hand axis. You can see, of course, that spiked up with the Russian war on Ukraine and spiked up again with Hamas's attack on Israel. And you can see the fragmentation keyword index, the blue here, you can see that spiking up as well. The indication that we're looking towards a fragmentation in the global economy, in global trade. I don't see this trend reversing. There's a saying in finance, the trend is your friend. I mean, it's not always a friendly trend, but you shouldn't necessarily bet against certain trends. Given that this one is broad and sweeping and global and persistent, it looks likely to continue or even accelerate. And then there's the 2022 Chinese Directive in Document 79. Maybe you saw reports about this just in the past week in the Wall Street Journal and other major media. It's a protocol called Delete A. Delete A. What does that stand for? It's Delete America. And the goal is, again, you can find this in most major media, the goal is for China to eliminate the reliance on any US-produced hardware or software. This directive was pushed forward, document 79 in 2022. This is well underway. In the not too distant future, in the United States, I think in a 5 to 10 year window, it is highly likely we will not be permitted to use internet-connected devices that are made in China. That has pretty big implications if you work in a tech business. By the way, there have already been restrictions around tech if you're a DoD contractor. That's been true for many years. If you're a DoD contractor for the US Department of Defense, there's certain things you can't use when doing DoD projects. One of the things on the list, I mean, this is like a nefarious list of stuff you can't use when doing DoD work, right? Like diamonds from Sierra Leone are on the list. I'm not kidding, it's on the list, as is technology from China, which would include cell phones, tablets, laptops, desktops. Already exists. This is the reason the latest iPhones are being made in India. Going forward, you're going to see supply chains further bifurcate, become duplicative, and if you want to serve a market, you will need to choose. Do you want to serve the US, its allies, NATO countries, Korea, Japan, or do you want to serve China, Russia, Iran, North Korea? That will be the choice you'll have to make going forward. You will not be able to do both. And I realize CFIUS regulations have changed around funding for a while, but we're likely to see the funding regulations and provenance and who you serve as customers become much more restrictive going forward. As we think about influence, I know many of you are probably familiar with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is designed to spread economic influence across a broad range of countries. What you may not know is that over the last decade and a half, China has become the bank for emerging markets. Over 70% of emerging market debt is held by China. So if you're a developing, poor country, China's your bank. And I realize right now the Chinese economy is not in a good spot. They've got a construction crisis, they've stopped publishing youth unemployment, there's a saying too, right? Maybe you've heard it. There are lies, damned lies, and statistics. Well, like in the next level of data hell are Chinese statistics, right? In terms of reliability. But we also have problems, right? Our $34 trillion in debt, an extra trillion in debt every 100 days, right? That's a lot. That reduces our ability to project soft power diplomacy, our ability to fund different things, let alone the gridlock we see in our own political organizations, which undermine our ability to project effective military deterrence as a reliable ally, right? We see that now with the bill stuck in Congress related to funding for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. If we had less debt, had more money, we might be able to do more things. And of course, all this was brewing before COVID, right? You see those tensions going up, and then COVID happens. And then what, right? Then we end up with what I've often called the Scavenger Hunt supply chain. This is New York Fed data. It's the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. You can see the giant mountainy spikes on the right. The first spike is related to COVID, as is part of the second spike. And then in 2022, you get the Russian war in Ukraine, which causes further commodity disruptions, adding more supply chain pressures. Now, the Russian war in Ukraine, that's directly related to Cold War II, but as a result of COVID, we realized how exposed all our supply chains were for medical devices, for equipment, for parts. I remember sitting down with the CEO of a manufacturing company and some other CEOs, sitting down with a trade expert just a couple of years ago, 2022. And the manufacturing CEO asks, like, this is one of the country's leading trade experts up in DC. The CEO, she says, we manufacture various equipment and we get a certain component from China. What can I do? The trade expert says, can you get the component from somewhere else? And the manufacturing CEO says, no. Trade expert says, well, you need to get that component from somewhere else. Everyone who runs a manufacturing business has been on notice for this for years. I did a tech project on this for one of the biggest tech companies in the world about 5, 6 years ago now. And they wanted to know where to move their operations out of China. I asked, how many times do you want to move it in the next 20 years? And they said, once. I said, allow me to introduce you to the NAFTA region. So there are real risks. And those lengthened supply chains add disruption potential, right? When we needed medical devices and equipment, or even masks and gloves, a lot of those came from China. And there was huge delays. We realized how exposed our supply chains were. Which led me to a conclusion that we're destined for proxy war. Maybe you've read the book by Graham Allison, Destined for War. This is a little bit of a play on that. And in 2020, I contributed to a Pentagon report that came out in June, which was a global futures report. My title, my section, my chapter was The Future Nexus of Supply Chains and National Security. I was writing exactly about these risks. And the scenario that I viewed as most likely was destined for proxy war. Why? Because over the last 100, 150 years, almost every war in the world has been a proxy war. Right? World War I, World War II, exceptions, but almost everything else, right? The war in Spain, right, with Franco, Korea, Vietnam, all of these were proxy wars. So yeah, this is something folks know is getting worse, and it's been brewing for years. It's accelerating now. So if you, as a tech business, have a supply chain that extends into, if you're in the US and it extends into China, that's a real risk. If you're in the US providing goods into China, you need to know about the Delete A protocol. Additionally, as we think about the proxy wars we're now facing, I refer to it as the coalition of the disgruntled. And we see that there are fractal conflict risks that come associated with this. But basically, when 2022 happened, when the Russian war in Ukraine started, I thought a most likely scenario for where that conflict would go, unfortunately, would probably be Korea at some point. I still think that's the most likely scenario. You end up with a frozen conflict. By the way, the Korean War is still ongoing. There is no peace treaty for that war. You end up with a demilitarized zone, a begrudged armistice, no one says peace, there's not peace, and you end up with weapons pointed at each other and missile tests for the better part of maybe this century or longer. But there are many other countries that I was concerned at that time would pile on. It took them 2 years, but they're piling on now. You know, what starts and is unlikely to end soon with the Russian war on Ukraine, where the lines of scrimmage have remained relatively unchanged for a little while, spills over into Iran's axis of resistance, right? Big question, cui bono? Russia bono. Russia bono, big time. And it's not just what's going on with Israel and Gaza, but you may not be aware, but many days, most days in recent months, U.S. troops, bases, and facilities are being attacked in Syria and Iraq. And of course, there's the Houthi rebels that are harassing the shipping channel of the Red Sea. This looks a lot like Cold War I, because in the first Cold War, the Middle East was often a very unfortunate testing ground for the US and Soviet Union's latest weaponry. Why in the world are the Iranians sending ballistic missiles and drones to the Houthis? Oh, well, they want to test them. They want to see how they can make them better. They're testing on really easy to hit large shipping vessels, so that in the future, if they're attacking military vessels, right, which they are also attacking military vessels with them, but if they're going to get better at it. That's what this is. All of this is like a military testing ground for the Cold War baddies who are gotten back together again. And just to make sure it's also plain, like the materiel, the supply chains are integrated, right? North Korea has sent vastly more artillery shells to Russia to use against Ukraine than the US and NATO combined have sent to Ukraine to use against Russia. Drones and ballistic missiles are coming from Iran to Russia. Ballistic missiles are coming from North Korea to Russia to use against Ukraine, right? All this stuff is moving together. And China is more or less laundering the commodities that can't be sold into the open market and turning them into finished goods. So the raw materials from China that may be subject to different kinds of restrictions and bans, they're going through China, which is more or less the bank. So all of this, you can see, right, this is a coalition of countries that lost out in the Cold War, and they're coming together. They're not alone, though. There's a pile-on, right? You look at Venezuela. They've indicated they would like half of the neighboring country, Guyana. Even Serbia's voiced its intentions around Srpska, which is a disputed part of Bosnia around Sarajevo. So there are a number of different countries here that are looking to pile on, see if they can get theirs. We're a little bit distracted in the US with some of our domestic politics, hence we can't get aid bills passed, or we were without a speaker in the House for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that, right? So that's what's going on. And you may wonder how many people knew these things were risks, right? Especially if we think about some of the biggest negative impacts going on right now are in Europe, right? Where the disruption of Russian natural gas, which was super cheap and easy and flowing in to Germany and the rest of Europe, made a green energy revolution possible. The Germans were able to shut down coal plants, mothball nukes. How many people knew that there were big chunks of Europe that were wildly reliant on Russian gas? By the way, this map here, you can see the different color codes. This is also from the IMF. Hungary is over 40%. Most of Central Europe in the 20 to 40% range in terms of reliance on Russian natural gas. And this is a big reliance, right? And when you see the Russian war in Ukraine start, the volumes collapse. 450 million cubic meters per day down to between 50 and 100 cubic meters per day coming into Europe. US LNG has proved very helpful for helping Europe wean off of these nat gas imports. But you may wonder, like, did people know? And I want to be the first to tell you they did. Let me tell you a little story. Almost 16 years ago, I was working on a project when I was at McKinsey, large consulting project. It was in Europe for a Russian-German joint venture around natural gas. I was a risk specialist working in Germany, a subsidiary of multiple public companies. My job was to look at the risk books. And it was to evaluate the different trading positions of the natural gas and to determine if the hedges were properly made and what their trading strategy should be. In order to do this, I had to look at trading contracts that were super secret and go out decades. Only handfuls of people have ever seen these contracts. But it was my job because I was a risk specialist. Now, it was a German project. Our working language was German, so we always used German on the team. One day, though, a senior partner comes in, pulls me aside, says to me in English, because he wants to make sure I get it, he says, "Jason, don't ask too many questions." And I say, well, look, I have to ask questions. I'm looking at the risk books. I got to do the thing. He's good. No, we don't want to find your body in a dumpster. So like 2 months later, I was able to get myself on a project in Chicago. So I told that story once in a room, and a guy in the back yells, he goes, "We got dumpsters in Chicago too." I said, but they're not meant for me. So people knew, but they often couldn't talk about how reliant these supply chains were. And if we think about redrawing supply chains, you can see here, this is a graph from the IMF. The red line is the goods trade between the different blocks, right? Between the US and its block and the Soviet Union and its block. And you can see, we go back to the Cold War, and that was only like 5% of trade. Right? Today, it's over 20%. So it's going to be really painful if we go back to low levels of trade between countries that we had in Cold War I. And of course, the global trade to GDP ratio, that's the blue, like that's gone up. That went up through really 2008, what they call globalization. But since then, we've been in slowbalization. But it looks very likely to reverse going forward, especially for dual-use technologies. So not just all of the laptops, cell phones, tablets, but anything that could be used both for civilian purposes and military purposes. So certain consumer goods, clothing, toys, like that's not the priority. The priority is various kinds of things that could be used for both, especially things with internet connectivity. You may have seen what happened recently with the port announcement, right? A number of the large cranes at US ports, the vast majority of them are made in China, and they had additional monitoring equipment on them that has been described as looking like it's spying on what's going on at the ports. So now they all have to be taken out and replaced. And maybe you think certain kinds of equipment or maybe things you make aren't relevant, but if you've pitched anything in your business where you said, this is going to be part of smart technology, we're going to make this into a smart X, yeah, that counts. That's dual use. As we look at trade flows, there's also something else really interesting. 2021 in blue, 2023 in red. This is the distance by location of supplier looking at trade. What's happening is supply chains are getting longer. Trade is making additional stops in the global supply chain. Some of this may be transshipments, but supply chain shipping is getting longer. And of course, things like the Houthis launching missiles into the Red Sea don't make it any better, right? Because then that makes certain shippers want to go all the way around the Horn of Africa in order to avoid going through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And of course, there have been issues at the Panama Canal as well, though that's not geopolitically related. And then there's also, thinking back on the green energy piece, a risk around battery supplies. In addition to having massive shortfalls globally of some of the most critical materials that go into batteries, a lot of these materials are produced in a high preponderance in China and Russia. And you can see, right, this is going to be a problem if we're going to use a lot of batteries. So if any of your solutions are focused on battery expansion, battery acceleration, right, improving battery tech, be careful about where those supplies come from because they may not be as secure as you think they are. And this gets back to that discussion I had with a large public tech company where they said, well, if we have to move our ops once in 20 years, where do we go? And I said, let me point you to the NAFTA region. This is actually a graphic from Charter, shows it really well. Last year, biggest trading partner in the world, the U.S. biggest source of imports, was Mexico at $439 billion. China, number 2 at $393, but coming in at a close third, just $5 billion less, was Canada. And there's a really good chance Canada could surpass China's value of imports this year. And that's what we're going to see probably on trend going forward is more trade, more imports moving away from China to other countries. Now, as we think about soft power diplomacy and economic influence and economic statecraft, often something that comes up is a discussion of BRICS, right? Originally, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You can see the different color codes here. This graphic from Visual Capital is the red, the original BRICS members. The green are new, although Argentina has since pulled out. The yellow are members that have applied. So you've got a number of countries moving into this. And I know the question I often get is, won't they have a currency that replaces the dollar? And I'd say, first of all, let's look at the dollar. Oh, there it is. Looks really strong. If we thought it was going away, we'd have a different perspective. The second thing is, monetary unions are notoriously difficult. And a question some people often ask, although they asked a lot more in the past, is what about the fate of the euro? And I happen to live in Frankfurt, Germany in the mid-2000s, when the best nightclub in Europe was in the basement of the European Central Bank. It was the only central bank in the world to ever have a nightclub. No, really, living XXL. It was a great nightclub. You see all the people out front, bunny ears and such. I mean, they advertise, it's really small to see, but they advertise it as in the basement of the European Central Bank, right? Now, today, the ECB is a really big building on the edge of Frankfurt, sort of an Ayn Rand dream of glass and steel. But at this time, if you said, is the euro going away? Like, all right, there's a nightclub in the basement, like maybe. But today, it's much less an issue. And as we think about the BRICS, I want you to just ponder for a second, if the euro was in question, and that was between countries that are in the same place, with the same form of government, with very similar economies, that rotate, that share the presidency of who's running the ECB, I want you to ask yourself, would China ever let Brazil or South Africa or Ethiopia run its monetary policy? If you think no, then the odds of a BRICS currency are really low, right? I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I think ideally what China would want is all these folks just to use their currency, but it doesn't float freely. It's in a measured band that's controlled. And if you look and you want to know why gold prices are up, and in part why Bitcoin's up and other stuff, right? Like what's going on, you see different parties around the world, especially on the gold side, they're stockpiling because they're concerned about what happens if we get more conflict. What will be the disruption to global monetary systems? But again, even without a nightclub in the bank basement, right, I don't think BRICS is going to happen. Is it a conference? Yes, countries get together like the G20 and they talk about stuff. Great. Are they going to have a shared monetary policy? No, they will not. And looking at investment trends, you may wonder, is China, like with all this, I've just talked about money already, is it a great place to invest? And don't quote me on this, the US Commerce Secretary said last August that China was uninvestable. Actually, back in 2022, I gave a talk to a large group of institutional investors. These are pension managers, and they were terrified. They were terrified that what happened in Russia would happen next in China. Russia's sort of the beta test. What happened? If you owned investments in Russia before the Russian war in Ukraine, they were worth something. And a few months later, they were worth absolutely zero. They're what's called distressed assets. All the stuff you owned, a giant goose egg. Write it off your balance sheet. It's worthless. It's gone. Now, Russia is a big country, right? Geographically, the biggest country on earth, but economically only the size of Italy. China is a much bigger economy. What happens if in a war or, let's say, naval embargo that turns into a blockade that morphs into additional pressure, like instead of a direct outright war, like something like that, let's say like that happens, and then we put restrictions on assets in China, and all the investments you've made, your companies have made, the public companies in your portfolios have, or the ETFs and mutual funds you own, they own stuff in China, that stuff all goes to zero. That will hurt a lot more than Russia. So for years, this has already been a big concern. The writing is literally on, well, it's on this wall anyway. And if you want to know about FDI, which is foreign direct investment, you may wonder, like, what, as a country, what are we seeing in terms of money going into or out of China? Well, just 2 years ago in 2021, $344 billion flowed into China on net. That's net foreign direct investment. Last year, it was 15. Less than 5% of that. So that's a huge drop-off. And in fact, in Q3 last year, it went negative. First time in history. Negative FDI. More money left China than went in. Investors and businesses are scared. If you're in the tech industry and one of your pitches is, we've got really reliable manufacturing in China, you may not. If one of the things in your pitch deck is, we're going into the Chinese market, you may not. And thinking about the imports, as I've already kind of mentioned, you can see on the left, China, U.S. imports as a percent of the total in red, dropping off pretty hard. Mexico in yellow going up pretty fast. And on the right, FDI, foreign direct investment, where is U.S. money going? The green line is India, the yellow is Mexico, and the UAE is in blue. China's in red, dribbling down to almost nothing. It's going to go lower. It's just too big a risk. And if you don't want to know what countries are gaining imports, are doing for FDI, check it out. On the left, you can see a change in U.S. import shares versus Chinese export. And on the right, the change in U.S. import shares versus FDI from China. You can see that countries gaining market share in U.S. imports are also receiving more FDI and exports from China. So, there are some pretty big risks, and if you want to be on the right side of the money side, you probably want to be careful about what you're doing or sending or sourcing from China. The other thing I want to point out is economic integration, ideology uncertainty. In a more integrated world, right, there's higher uncertainty around countries, ideology, and political alliances. You look at the left, we can see Cold War I on the left, 1947 and 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. On the right is 2022, that's global trade to GDP ratio. Much higher global trade to GDP ratio today, right? That's more economic integration. On the right, you see the change in government ideology over time, 47 and 91. It's much more stable. In the post-Cold War period, it's been much more volatile. So even though we have a more globally integrated economy on the trade side, political uncertainty is pretty high. And then there's individual risks. Any Americans here travel to China frequently for your business or send your people to China for business? Okay, this section's for you. Middle of last year, China passed a new national security law. It gives them broad, sweeping abilities to implement an exit ban. This was the result from the U.S. State Department that raised China from a level 2 country to a level 3. There are 4 levels of State Department evaluations of foreign countries. Level 4, do not travel. That's like Afghanistan today. Level 3 is reconsider travel, which means you're a private citizen. As a private citizen, you're allowed to go wherever you want. But just because you can, you really shouldn't, right? But it's reconsider travel. And allow me to read off a couple lines, because I know this is kind of big in the back. Reconsider travel due to the arbitrary enforcement of local laws, including in relation to exit bans and the risk of wrongful detentions. In addition, U.S. citizens traveling or residing in the People's Republic of China may be detained without access to U.S. consular services or information about their alleged crime. U.S. citizens in the PRC may be subjected to interrogations and detentions without fair and transparent treatment under the law. But wait, there's more. U.S. citizens might only become aware of an exit ban when they attempt to depart. This has happened to people when they're trying to check out of their hotel or they're at the airport. And if you're traveling with minor children, they may also be subject to an exit ban. So China, a great place to go if you never want to come back. This is real, folks. I would not advise anyone to go, truly. It's a big risk. And if you send your people, or you go, you should be aware. I mean, and there are a number of stories about this, right? In the Journal, Wall Street Journal, and other sources of many people who've had this experience. There are many different news stories of people who've been subject to these exit bans. It's a significant risk. In fact, if you're doing business with any of these countries in the Cold War II coalition that we're up against now, you should be aware of MICE. Let me tell you what this is. This is an old Cold War strategy that's going to come back again. What you want to do is you want to flip people. And the way you do it is with MICE, which stands for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. So let's say you have subject to someone to an exit ban. Yesterday I was talking to the CEO of a pretty sizable public company, and we were talking about the exit ban risk. And I said, you know, what's going to happen if one of your people gets detained? And then they're forced to share whatever your company's IP are. Here's my Dropbox. What do you want? Take it all. Right? They're not trained in counter-interrogation. They're not Siri trained. They don't know what to do to resist that. They're being held without access to consular services or legal counsel, being told they're going to be held in perpetuity, subject to an exit ban. They're going to give up everything they have. So if you're sending your people to China with any of your intellectual property, just know they could be subject to an exit ban and very easily flipped. If you can't flip them with a suitcase of money or a flash drive with some Bitcoin, like you could flip them with something else. Maybe you get them in a compromising position. Very popular during the Cold War. You don't need to be violent. You just put them in a really weird, unfortunate situation with a two-way mirror in their hotel room, and you got them good. You could also appeal to their ego, or you could try to get them on your ideology, although that's a little bit less this time around. But you're going to try to flip folks and take whatever they've got of value. You need to know your people are at risk. Your IP is at risk. So to summarize some of the key risks and threats for tech businesses, I've mentioned these already, but we'll go through them just to make sure I drive it home. There is distressed asset risk. If what happened in Russia happens in China, your stuff there may no longer be your stuff. Supply chain risks, disruptions, and costs, right? We see it now with insuring various shipping. We see it now with shipping costs, container rates. Whatever cost you're looking at in the shipping world, a lot more is being flown places by air freight. Why? Well, you know, there's all kinds of disruption risks. There could be reduced or restricted access to capital. There are end market risks, travel risks, and MICE exposures, right? And the Delete A, the Delete America protocol that's been laid out in document 79 that's designed to eliminate all technology, hardware and software from China that's made in the US. Now there are opportunities, and I've alluded to some of these as well. First thing I'd point out is if we're going to see more reshoring, more onshoring, more activity moving out of China, moving into Mexico, moving into the US, moving into the Americas, these are areas, the US especially with a very tight labor market, you're going to see a lot of opportunities. We're probably also going to need more automation, right? Right now, the country in the world with the most robots is China. We're going to need a lot more robots in North America. There's also going to be needs for supply chain solutions that add greater transparency around this. The NAFTA region and the Americas are going to have significant growth opportunities. There are needs for unexposed sustainability solutions. We think about battery materials coming from China and Russia. There are needs and opportunities around that. There are likely to be government and DoD funding opportunities for some industries, right? We see it with the CHIPS Act. We're going to see it with a lot more areas and industries in tech. And there's going to be a significant need for provenance. And while most people, when they think of NFTs, right, they might think of things like the Bored Apes, which are now t-shirts for sale at Walmart for $5. Like, what it also could be is a marking that you have on goods that are being shipped that demonstrate its provenance. Because in the future, you will need to demonstrate, it's not just, oh, I swear this internet-connected device wasn't made in China, didn't come from China. You're going to have to demonstrate that provenance in the future. Disclaimer, I know you're all going to read it. Everything could be wrong. And my contact info. So with that, I thank you very much. And I'd love to open up for a couple of questions. Thank you.